we advise on multiple things based on our expertise, but also on matters that we are called upon to respond and think of. My first paper that I did on what did NREG achieve in terms of poverty, it had a direct impact on reduction of poverty. But you know what my second paper showed me? Your real rural wages increased almost 40% within 4 to 5 years. But you know what else it did? Hundreds of thousands of micro enterprises became non-viable. क्योंकि आप labor charge afford नहीं कर सकते आप. In 1960s, when Pandit Nehru was keen, like many other leaders of the time, to impose a minimum wage legislation, Mahalanobis, who was one of his advisors, warned him against it, right? Saying that, you know, Japan has had 100 years of economic growth before they instituted some form of minimum wage. ये तो 60s में है.
We started on the journey of welfare before
we could afford it.
So yes. That's the tension today.
Yes. Think of Punjab. Punjab had thriving industry 20 years back.
No longer.
No longer. Why? Because cross-subsidization, which is what you're talking about, that when you are going to overcharge or penalize or just charge so much to one sector to cross-subsidize another sector, you should not imagine, and that's why economics is such a beautiful science when you begin to study, that yaar ye accounting nahi hai ki aap till cows come home you will keep taxing and charging more for power and giving it to farmers. वो नहीं हो सकता है. What happened in Punjab? All industry vanished. Where did they go? हिमाचल चले गए, इधर उधर सब जगह चले गए. Where they are more investor friendly, where they are more industry friendly, and that is where I think conversation on Delhi कि utilities free कर देना. Well, is it price discrimination of some kind where इतना usage के बाद it will escalate as it is, or are we to say, you know, that bandwidth you keep expanding, so very large number of people are going to get free stuff. Then the problem is, how are you going to do electricity, you know, the distribution reforms that you have to. For the first 10 years, our major infrastructure push was on connectivity. But the additional or the marginal gains from building one more highway or one more airport is unlikely to be as high as it was in the last 10 years. Which means that the more efficient way, which will feed into growth directly, is to now do a little bit of a realignment towards cities. Okay. India today is far more urban than what people traditionally believe, right? So this whole, the Gandhian belief that India resides in villages is not true at all.
Because the villages want to come to the cities.
For 10 years, why have we not been able to completely reverse this decline in private investment? That how do we, when there is such growth and such improvements on the ground, in terms of infrastructure, your costs are coming down. Why is it not getting reflected in private investments scaling up?
From every certificate you need, they have fixed digitization. You cannot, that OTP will never come. Somebody is sitting there with a cookie, you have to go give 500 rupees, they remove that cookie and then your OTP will come. They have fixed the GST. Okay, because you see, it's not as if the private sector is not corrupt. So the private sector guys, chartered accountant, lawyers stop making money. So now they've done a little handshake with the GST officer and the demands are now back on the table. So we are deeply corrupt. For a middle class person who's paying taxes, how do we even imagine to be a developed country when we are so deeply corrupt?
There you must ask a question that it's the same Delhi walas. We will chase and behave very badly when it comes to buses. We'll jostle and think of the subway system, the metro, everyone is orderly. It's the same population. So it tells you something about certitude, meaning certainty of public infrastructure, both in terms of aayega, 3 minutes mein the next train is coming.
Correct.
Right? So everybody's better behaved. You know, on the ease of doing business, we have improved on every parameter except one, contract enforcement.
I can't help just talk about the paper that I've read, which you wrote on if the judiciary would work just one extra Saturday, I think the
20
tendency,
20 judgments would be passed.
Has this government sort of tied its own hands in 2016 when they make RBI an inflation targeting central bank? Because inflation, we know, is the harshest tax on the poor. In this context, where are we on growth? And if things are so good on the ground with consumption, why am I not seeing better rates of growth? This is the Growing India podcast, and I'm Monika Halan. I'm here to take you on a journey where you will meet thought leaders across the areas of economics, policy, and geopolitics. I promise not to miss the micro for the macro, and both the trees and the wood will be discussed. I have the perfect guest here for you today. Distinguished economist Dr. Shamika Ravi. Dr. Shamika Ravi is a distinguished Indian economist and a key member of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister of India. She is renowned for her expertise in development economics, has over 20 years of experience focusing on critical areas like finance, healthcare, urbanization, gender equality, and poverty alleviation. Dr. Ravi has taught postgraduate programs in India, was Research Director at Brookings India, and Vice President Economic Policy at the Observer Research Foundation. I am so delighted to welcome you today to this podcast, Shamika. Thank you so much for being here. Welcome to the Growing India podcast.
Thank you, Monika.
On a working day to come talk to us, again, thank you. I'm going to start off, Shamika, with the conversation to say that what exactly does an economic advisor to the PM do? Like, are you a private think tank? And also, one or two things you may have, advised the PM on, which you saw fructify into actual policy on the ground. So just briefly.
So EAC, unlike let's say Niti Aayog or other research arms of the government, the Economic Advisory Council is to the Prime Minister. And we report therefore to PM / the senior advisors within PMO. We advise on multiple things, Monika, based on our expertise, but also on matters that we are called upon to respond and think of. Of some matters now, I would say half of what we do comes out in the public, or maybe it's even lesser than that. My attempt always is, because on structural matters, on matters of long-term concerns, where data is to inform policy, I think there is a considerable amount of work also to be done to engage with people at large and researchers at large and thinkers and so on, so it gets published.
Okay, and that's a big one, and that's a great segue for me to go to my first topic, which is poverty.
Yeah.
Let me give you a little background. So I've seen the poverty statistics over the last, say, 3 years, where different papers have mapped absolute poverty going down, and we can define that $2 per capita per day, set by the World Bank, not by the Indian government. But there's been so much resistance within the country to accepting that from, I think, a number of, I think, 60% in 1980s. Yeah. This number is down to like single digits. Whoever, you can pick any paper.
That's correct.
But it is a single digit number. And I looked at one of your speeches at one of the Lit Fests, and I went and looked at the World Poverty Clock. Yeah. It's dramatic what you see. You see the colors changing from on way to having met the development goals around poverty. So just talk to me a little bit about what should I believe?
That's such a fundamental question, Monika. I'll tell you, Garibi Hatao has been a slogan we have all grown up with, right? And I would imagine so have our parents' generations. So there is a mindset around it, and I think that is also the reason why, from a policy perspective, it is such a priority. Right? No governments can completely ignore aspects of poverty. So poverty is an important aspect of public policy making, of economic growth for us in India. Right? So it's a very inclusive democracy in that sense. Now, there are different ways to measure poverty. For instance, if you saw what the Niti Aayog published a few years back, that is based on the multidimensional poverty index, because we didn't have consumption expenditure data. Basically, that looks at, it's an Alkire method that was devised to look at what is the access to education, health, and living quality. So quality of housing, let's say. So it's very much based on amenities and things that you have. Right? The traditional way of looking at poverty is consumption expenditure. So I'll go back to our own traditional methods, in which I think most Indians are familiar because of the debates at that time, the Tendulkar method. But Tendulkar method was a very basic method, which really looked at bhukmari. So you looked at the amount of expenditure a household should be able to make in order to meet the daily caloric requirement. So मुझे 2000 calories खाने हैं, जिसके लिए how much money should I really have the capability to spend? But that is too basic. And that is why I think the Rangarajan committee recommendation that was tabled. So Tendulkar was around 2006 is when the committee was set up. 9 is when the recommendations had come in. A lot of brouhaha, debate, it was not accepted, right? And there was a big sort of public, fight over it. But then when Rangarajan committee recommendation was tabled, the committee was set up in 2012 and it tabled in June of 2014. So I think it basically got buried in the transformation,
right.
the change. But when I look at it as an economist, someone who cares about this issue, Rangarajan committee recommendation, while it is moderate because it's food, it's healthcare, it's education, and for urban areas it's rental, conveyance.
Okay, so it's taking all of this into account.
All of this into account.
And is there
so
a
it's
number?
Relatively better.
So is there like a number which says that if it is so it's an expenditure?
Yeah,
right?
it's an expenditure. So in some ways it's moderate. Now the thing to remember, Monika, that it's higher than $2.15 of the World Bank.
Okay,
Huh?
it's higher than
so
that.
It's higher than that. Now
how much higher would that be?
So let me tell you that in terms of Rangarajan poverty line, it was around 880 for rural areas and around 1,000 11 years back. If you look at it today, that number is around 2,700
okay.
For urban areas and it's around 2,100 for rural. But the point to note is, if you just look at that same benchmark, inflation adjusted, then as per the consumption expenditure of 11-12, which was the last consumption expenditure survey from the NSS, India had 29.5% poverty.
Okay.
Today that number is down to 3.9.
Okay.
Right? So it's a massive. Nobody will...
you cannot argue with this.
It's publicly available data. It's the best data you have, right? It's the best data you've always had. So there is no shifting of goalposts. There's no shifting of definition. Inflation adjust karke, simplest metric mein, India has eradicated poverty of this nature. Of course, now we can say that let's revise the poverty.
No, of course.
Levels
it's an ongoing conversation.
Correct.
That is an ongoing conversation. So we can... So, okay, I want to ask you one more question. So, when you actually meet people who may not be economists or they say that how do we trust that the data that this government is putting out is correct?
Okay,
and
so
I don't know how to answer that question because, I mean, either you trust the data or you don't. So, do you trust the data when GDP is falling? And you don't trust it when GDP is rising. There's a fundamental flaw in the way that you're consuming.
But I'll tell you, the serious economist will not make such a flippant argument.
No. This is like,
this is common people
you meet.
But it's not even common people. I think these are vested interests sometimes. And I'll tell you the best defense. Why do I look at data?
Yeah.
The reason you look at data, Monika, is that otherwise it is your lived reality versus my lived reality.
Right.
I'll say, oh, bahut kharab hai.
Yeah.
And you'll say, bahut acha hai. Where is reality? So data is as relatively objective as you can possibly get. Right? Now the data has to be representative. It has to be large enough in that sense. It has to be varied enough to pick up rural-urban differences across your states. Wo sab hai. So given that the data is public, it's not proprietary data that is often quoted by people when it comes to jobs or any other, right? This is government data. Ye bilkul public hai. Everything that I'm citing and quoting to you
is public data.
Is public. And in fact, everything that I publish, Monika, is a matter of principle. Because I realize that my job is to show a mirror.
Right.
As objective mirror as I can possibly. Although it can only happen through publicly available data. So I'm not going to hide behind proprietary data, even the government's administrative data. No. And the second is, it's easy to replicate.
Right, absolutely.
So anyone who pushes back on this, आप बोलो कि फिर मुझे counterfactual दिखाओ.
Yeah. So and the other thing that again we think about is that could the numbers be so drastically going down because of the free food program? 800 million people. So if you include that, is that sustainable? Like.
That's a great question. Now, let me put it in a perspective. Yes, it is sustainable. Simply because we have abundance of food grain. That is number one.
I can take you into a long journey into farm laws and free electricity, water, no taxation. I'm sorry.
The sustainability from ecological, the whole
and
aspect
also
of
financial.
North India, wo alag, ab alag.
Right.
The fact is, the way things stand,
right.
India has abundance of food grain. That is number one. Number two, to say that poverty is reducing because you're giving food free food grain. Yes, free food grains are included in your consumption expenditure, by the way, because NSS really asks you of what you consume, how much is from the government's free,
Right.
and wo bhi free food program of the state or the center. It is remarkably disaggregated good data, right? But to ask, is it because of this, is like saying, well, is Scandinavia developed because they have all these welfare? When was the last time you heard an economist or anyone else ask that question? It's an absurd question.
Okay.
It's a lived reality. The whole idea of government policy is to improve people's lives. So yes, welfare is in education, in healthcare, in livability, and in food.
Is
right?
it sustainable?
Here is the thing. देखो free food grain जो है ना, what I noticed through the data when I analyzed, and we published this in September last year. Because what you're noticing is that people are saving on food grains. Every Indian, regardless of the quintile, rich and poor, they are eating 2 kilograms fewer food grains every month. So what are they eating? They have diversified
Yeah,
their
I want
food
to talk
away.
to you about this.
But
Like,
what
please
is,
tell us.
but only food grains are
Uh,
free, no? There's all the savings are being now transferred, or basically you are diversifying your food plate. Which means essentially what the government has done, it has fiscalized the food plate of the bottom 50% of.
explain, fiscalize it. Just explain that for everyone. Yeah.
Fiscalization means the government is paying for it in the form of MSP. We have, so here is the thing, we have a massive regime in the agriculture sector of minimum support price, which is heavy in terms of food grains, right? Rice and wheat in particular. And those are the two things that you procure. And when you procure it and you make it available, subsidized or free, in essence, these are savings to the household. And that saving is now getting channeled in the form of major 40% increase in milk, fish, eggs and meat, fresh fruits. Now, all of these items are not cheap traditionally the way you look at it, but the consumption of the bottom 20% has also, in fact, they have seen the biggest increase. And in the remotest part of the country, Monika. So that's why I have faith that this is actual, and kilogram also, not that people are eating. Let me just give you an example. That 10, 11 years back, only 60% of Indians overall used to report that they are eating some fresh fruits.
Okay.
Today that number is 93%.
What are you
across.
saying?
Sab
What
kha
are you
rahe.
saying?
Everybody has now. These are not fanciful.
Whatever.
Apple, banana,
Yeah.
sabko mil raha.
Fruit is fruit.
Everybody is getting it, right? And everywhere in the country. This is nothing short of a revolution, right? And this is what growth is meant and development is meant to achieve.
Right.
Iska direct impact is on micronutrients and anemia.
On health.
On health.
Immediately on health.
Immediately on health. So think of what your free food grain policy is able to achieve in terms of consumption and diversification.
Okay. Okay. And this impact on public health, basically health of individuals, we will actually see over the decade.
100.
I mean, these are long arc changes which are very difficult to map in the short term.
True.
Right? So just talk to me a little bit about, we are saying poverty is down to 3%.
Correct.
We've defined it in a certain way.
And this is average, which means in many states it's below 1%.
Below 1%.
Yes.
We're saying Indians across the board, across the country are eating healthier. They are eating better.
100%.
Talk to me a little bit on the implications on the country. Like on, say, for example, on the industry.
Yeah.
Like how does the industry impact? Because
from
finally,
free food grains.
Yeah, from just
poverty.
Having less poverty.
Yes.
Yeah.
Fundamentally, human productivity, labor productivity will grow, right? People will fall sicker less. And we are seeing direct impact on anemia is one thing we have measured. You are going to see people now, health-seeking behavior is becoming better. Meaning, for your bottom 50% people, earlier only 17% had got some hospitalization at some point in time in the last 1 year. Today that number is up 23%. But not because poor people are falling sick more. They have been falling sick throughout. Now they can avail.
Also, Ayushman Bharat would have
it's a big push.
Huge push.
Yeah. And so Ayushman Bharat and the health insurance, which is publicly financed, that is very clearly showing that the vulnerability of your bottom 50% has come down. Meaning earlier, if you had anybody in the household fall sick and get hospitalized, the consumption of the household had to come down.
Correct.
Which meant that, you postponed the vacation, you didn't buy the footwear or the clothing, something. Now that is not happening. It's happening at a much, much smaller scale. And that's why we are saying maybe the conversation has to move away from poverty
Yeah.
to vulnerability. कि consumption किसको fluctuate करना पड़ रहा है. I have a smooth consumption, which is what you and I want.
Right.
We don't want shocks.
Which also sort of segues into what I do, which is building financial stability.
Very important.
The minute you have an emergency fund,
Yes.
you are able to not have this volatility.
Yes.
You are smoothing out your consumption.
And that is what insurance is meant to achieve.
Correct.
And in this case, Ayushman has it. But the impact of less poverty on industry, by the way, think of free food grain, given that diversification has happened on the food plate, which means that an average Indian now wants eggs, fish and meat. So domestic demand for these items are through the roof. Milk products.
And that would also impact things like cold chains. It will impact
100%.
Food 100%. Processing.
And the rest of the agriculture sector, Monika. So in some ways, think of it that by sheer demand and by changing nature of consumption within the country everywhere, now production has to keep up. So now basically you're putting pressure on local policy makers to become, alter your production pattern to become more demand friendly, consumer friendly, but also the processing, right? The value chain, think of exactly what you said, that fresh fruits consumption rising in the remotest part of the country means what? Yeah. That it is able
to getting there. I mean, look, it's the food, the eggs, the milk is getting there.
Now, I'll tell you again, if you go back to the consumption expenditure survey and you see what has happened in the last 12 years, you will notice that the consumption has shifted away from food, which is a very basic item, to durable goods and consumables, right? In fact, consumables are the largest share of spending in urban India. So imagine what this does to middle class or our notion of middle class if now everybody, the focus is on mobility. So conveyance is 7 or 9% of monthly consumption expenditure. That's a major big jump. Also in rural areas, by the way, because improved road and improved connectivity means people are not only buying automobiles, but they're also traveling further from where I used to, right? Health and education. People are spending more than ever on health and education. The bottom 20% of Indians, 11, 12 years back, only 4% of them owned some automobile. Scooter hai, motorcycle hai, some, right? Today that number is 40%.
In the bottom 20?
Bottom 20%.
In the bottom 20%?
Yes. Imagine. Now, Sarkar, not that I know of. I don't know of any government, any political party jisne motorcycle or scooter di ho.
Right.
So that means
they're buying.
They're buying it. That's number one. Number two, it also tells you, because there's a lump sum amount, that perhaps formal banking is accessed.
And again, Jan Dhan. I mean, 2014 Jan Dhan.
Yes.
I've been as a journalist, I've been in the market. That was transformational. Yes. The accounts, like we had what? 40% of the people in the country with bank accounts. And over a year, we saw the transformation. Right? So this was, and again, I don't think we give credit enough.
No, we don't. But Monika, I'll tell you why people, the skeptics, well, first of all, the way I look at it when I see numbers, and I live in the reality of numbers, and that's why I want latest data. And that is my job, to tell the India story the way it is as of now. Because number one, who will tell your story? Where are the researchers and the scholars in the community who should be out there surveying, pushing governments at the local? Aap data collect karo, sarkaron se karao, but publish this. Let people know. It is not the job of common man. वो तो lived reality hai.
Correct.
Right?
It's your anecdote versus my anecdote.
Always. And I'll tell you, your World Bank publications, any global publications, they are outdated simply because they are not real time. They're not even 1 or 2 years. It's only now, like a couple of weeks back, that they have updated their poverty numbers.
Also, people need to know that India set out on the path of welfare before we developed, before our per capita income increased.
That's correct.
Whereas the West,
all right-thinking economists will not disagree with you.
No. I don't think an average person understands this tension that we have. So when we say, oh, Switzerland is like this, Sweden is like that, you know what? They did their welfare after a certain threshold of a per capita income.
Let me give you an example. In 1960s, when Pandit Nehru was keen, like many other leaders of the time, to impose a minimum wage legislation, Mahalanobis, who was one of his advisors, warned him against it. Right? Saying that, Japan has had 100 years of economic growth before they instituted some form of minimum wage. ये तो 60s में है. You have just started, right? 2 5-year plans.
You know what our
You
average
set up minimum wage. So it was a little bit like we put the cart before the horse. Therefore, increasing the cost of doing
right.
things.
So I think people need to understand that we started on the journey of welfare before
we could afford it.
So that's the tension today.
Yes.
But
But I'll tell you this, Monika, let's see it a little more contemporary way, right? And my own research and the numbers is where I learn. There is no pre-held hypothesis. When one might have philosophical sort of leanings that markets are superior, government is superior, वो बड़ा superficial हो जाता है. When you're looking at the way government makes policy, you have to look at इसका empirical impact हुआ क्या? NREGA. National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, as per which basically 100 days of minimum wage employment within 5 kilometers of where you reside was mandated, right, for all rural households or any rural household we approached. Now, as a law, when it got enacted and states did set up, it became like a de facto minimum wage legislation, right?
Right.
Now, my first paper that I did on what did NREG achieve in terms of poverty, it had a direct impact on reduction of poverty. But you know what my second paper showed me, which was a randomized control trial over 1,300 villages, etc. of Andhra Pradesh. And Andhra, this is unified Andhra, was one of our states which implemented NREG very well because they had the biometric card before Aadhaar. The implementation, they really did it very well. But so what was the impact? Your real rural wages increased almost 40%. 40% real rural wage बढ़ गए.
Okay.
Within 4 to 5 years. Now, rising rural wages did lead to reduction in poverty. But you know what else it did? Hundreds of thousands of micro enterprises became non-viable. क्योंकि आप labor charge afford नहीं कर सकते. Many fields lay unharvested because they couldn't afford or it wasn't viable to hire labor to do harvest. So you see, you did give up on growth.
Right.
Please, it is very important for people to recognize that any welfare that you do has a cost. And the cost is not what accountants think of cost.
Right.
इतना पैसा गया
Right.
finance ministry से. That is a simple way to look at it. The bigger cost is in terms of growth foregone. क्योंकि even a small दूध वाला, small plot of land, horticulture है या जो भी है, वो बेच करके कुछ तो revenue generate करता है, some value generate करता है. That is what economic growth is. You, by raising the labor cost, effectively many micro enterprises had to shut down. Right? That is the cost of NREG. Right. Is it an important? Yes. COVID may turned out to be one of the more important levers to make sure that we didn't have destitution or hunger deaths, etc. So that is what economics is about, this churn.
It's always you press something and then something completely unexpected
So what
happens.
is our job as an economist?
Right.
We advise कि this is the benefit you are likely to see from this, but these are your real costs. Not just the rupee cost. Yeah. So finance ministry ka check is not the cost. Yeah. What it does to the economy and the future
down the line.
Distortion.
Yes.
बहुत ज़रूरी.
Right. Shamika, what I'm hearing is that there is increasing consumption for the poor, for the middle class. Middle class as a cohort seems to have more heft. Yeah. Right. I'm not seeing the numbers translate into GDP growth or even private consumption is down. Like when you look at the macro numbers, all these are down. We saw extremely high rates of growth in the first UPA 5 years. But we also saw extremely high inflation levels soon after that. So there is an inflation-led growth which gives you higher growth numbers. Yeah. It does, real growth. So has this government sort of tied its own hands in 2016 when they make RBI an inflation targeting central bank? So for those who may not know, RBI today is mandated by the parliament to keep inflation in a band of 2 to 6 with a target of 4. Yeah. So you think the government has tied its own hands? Because inflation, we know, is the harshest tax on the poor. Yeah. In this context, where are we on growth? And if things are so good on the ground with consumption, why am I not seeing better rates of growth?
I think we have done very well, Monika, in the last 10, 12 years on welfare. Okay. First and foremost. Remember, almost every government that gets elected in India, development and welfare is a very important part of the promise and hence delivery. Number two, the repeated performance of the Modi administration, and you can see in the way it gets rewarded in repeat elections, despite numbers and so on, is on account of the fact that you are saving today 1.5% of your GDP because your welfare has become so much more efficient, right? What is now called by IMF, OECD, etc. as logistical marvel, DBT. So I think we have done welfare very well, right? Exceptionally well, and in fact, it has become almost like a blueprint for global south, and many countries are interested. So that part of the problem or the puzzle, I think we have solved it very well. The second part, which is what fuels this whole transformation and hence growth, requires many parties to play ball, right? And there, of course, the thing to remember is post the pandemic, over successive years, India has remained the fastest growing major economy in the world, despite all global turmoil, right? Is no mean feat. So first of all, I think it's important to understand that we've successfully isolated ourselves from these large turmoils globally, right? So those are all good things. Now, how do we get to 8.5, which is what we have to and which we are trying to push for, is you need both sides, the fiscal side and the monetary side, to play ball, right? This is where again I'll go back to consumption expenditure survey. Food,
Right.
when you estimate inflation, in the way we estimate inflation traditionally until now, 55% of weightage is given to food. But food for urban India is around 40 to 43% today. So you see now inflation, and therefore when you talk of poor being hit, food inflation or food as a basket of consumption, food component has shrunk significantly. This has to reflect in the way we estimate inflation. And therefore, the way our cost of capital or the interest rates are determined.
Correct.
So, I'm just trying to explain to you.
No, absolutely.
Where
Such an
is the
important
lag?
point.
Where
Such
is
an
the lag?
important point that as we change the nature of the country,
Yes.
we need to change the benchmark.
100%.
If we don't do that,
Yes.
then we are just doing this wrong.
Yes.
So what happens now? Like, what do we do?
What do we do? Well, number one, we change the way these weights and the way we estimate inflation, and hence the way the RBI sets its cost of
How do
capital
you
or the
do
interest
that?
rate. Well, the NSO is doing it, the National
Okay.
Statistical, because remember, the RBI has to respond to a formal change in strategy, right? Again, it's a data issue. So that's where these things have to be hastened. I think that's number one. And from the monetary side, you have to respond to the reality of India, which is different today, right? So cost of capital has to come down, right? Of course, in the recent two MPC meetings, you've seen it has come down, but cost of capital has remained high for some time. So I'm just trying to explain the growth part to you.
Right.
The second is because of elections and whatever, the government spending was also rather tight, right? And so we need, so basically you're saying there is tightening from both sides. But I don't think these are short-term issues, Monika. I think the bigger issue, which gets to investment, that is the big elephant in the room, that for 10 years, why have we not been able to completely reverse this decline in private investment?
Correct.
That how do we, when there is such growth and such improvements on the ground, in terms of infrastructure, your costs are coming down, why is it not getting reflected in private investments scaling up?
Right.
And this is where I think we'll have to talk about what I call elephant in the room is contract enforcement and the uncertainty climate that exists because we are not able to get our contract enforcement.
And that becomes a judiciary.
It is 100% a judiciary.
We've just seen one case where you turn back something which was decided 5 years ago.
We seem to be the only major economy where such major reversals happen. There is a GDP cost. When you introduce uncertainty into the system, when process becomes more paramount, not the outcome, you are likely to see fear, and uncertainty goes against investments.
Why is the judiciary interpreting things in this manner? So I have also looked at some of the judgments which have come in the capital market area.
Yeah.
And it's like, why would anybody do that? Why would you not go by the contract?
So I fundamentally, I'll tell you, I think for a dynamic, growing, aspirational economy like ours, just like we say we need real-time data, we need governance to be agile, we need judiciary, which is really responding to this kind of delay. without complete impunity.
Judicial reforms again, I mean,
It's a major bottleneck to Vikasit Bharat, the way you see it. Could be living standard
of changing, because all of us understand that. So anyone who follows policy, anyone who's following some of these events, see where the judiciary is the biggest bottleneck to a lot of things which happen on the ground. Do you see it changing at all?
You know, on the ease of doing business, we have improved on every parameter except one: contract enforcement. Right. So I think it's a problem which is well articulated. It is something that, as economists, as people watching markets, I mean, we know that there is a real cost and a long-term cost.
And I can't help just talk about the paper that I've read, which you wrote on if the judiciary would work just one extra Saturday. I think the 20
judgments would be passed.
So there is this problem, and I don't think there is enough. Like, that paper is fantastic because all you're doing is looking at data. Was there a pushback when you did this?
No, I don't know. No, I'll tell you, that is I think that is the beauty of empirical work done with publicly available data. And frankly, Monika, I have never faced any pushback on either the results, the methodology. People might not like it, and hence then they will write pieces or opposing.
That's
but
fine.
That doesn't bother me.
Fine.
Because it is not founded in anything specific.
No, but let's come back to private investment, and that's like we've all been thinking of green shoots and looking for them everywhere, but we don't see it. The other thing that I understand actually from the industry is that now they are waiting for the impact of AI to settle down before they do more outlays. So for the industry, it's also the cost of labor is not that cheap. Plus, you have a new technology coming in. At this moment when the world is in turmoil, increasingly it's safer to keep your capital in government bonds, US treasuries, just G-Secs. So then there is a real problem, because the government has, we want them to spend more on defense, on education, on health. But if government is doing the infra spend, the private sector is not doing it, we are constrained. Our growth is really shackled.
No, but I'll tell you, we are figuring a way out of it.
Okay, lovely.
Let me tell you how. And I mean strategically. You recall this budget announcement on urban, meaning 1 lakh crore as a promise, a pledge at this point, in terms of making urban planning, urbanization overall a mandate, a very serious mandate in terms of spending. Now, the way to see this whole infrastructure push is that for the first 10 years, our major infrastructure push was on connectivity. And that has had its, marginal sort of gains in terms of how the economy productivity overall has improved. But the additional or the marginal gains from building one more highway or one more airport is unlikely to be as high as it was in the last 10 years, which means that the more efficient way, which will feed into growth directly, is to now do a little bit of a realignment towards cities. India today is far more urban than what people traditionally believe, right? So this whole, the Gandhian belief that India resides in villages is not true at all.
Because the villages want to come to the cities.
You're right. And who can blame them? 80% of health infrastructure is in cities, right? Big cities. So, of course, what you and I want is what every other Indian, and particularly in the rural areas, also want. If you look at satellite image, if you look at concentration of households, density, etc., India is anywhere between 65 or 67% urban today. It's already urban. If it is already urban, then the urban amenities, the infrastructure has to keep up with this massive.
Which it hasn't. I mean, that was one of the things I wanted to discuss, that our lived urban lives are a nightmare. The minute you step out to a developed country, you see the roads, you see the amenities, you see the water, electricity. Here, just getting to work every day is a challenge. You feel the system is against you. And over there, you feel the system wants you to go to work. For a middle class person, again, living in the cities, it is this lack of urban amenities. So, and again, this is a state subject. So how is the central government going to do anything about it?
So there we'll have to use all levers that are there. One is, of course, if you remember the 73rd, 74th amendments, as per which urban local bodies were to be created, and the state was to share power, resource, etc. with the urban local body, just the way you have with the panchayats for the rural areas. That has not happened the way we would have. Very few areas actually have urban local bodies. Where they do, the mayors have 1 year term, 1 term of 5 years, and hence incentives are always a problem. The issue is, and this is I think the moot reason why I remain so optimistic on India, Monika, is that for this mammoth country, when you look at a problem of this magnitude, you will also find that there are states that have already found a solution to this seemingly immovable concern. I'll tell you, in places like Uttar Pradesh, the industrial development authorities, look at Noida, then Greater Noida, and there are 4, 5 now.
Noida is a story.
And it's interesting because for the last 10 years when we've studied urbanization, we've often compared Gurgaon and Noida.
Right.
Because Gurgaon is a private city. Everything was private, and then the government later tried to build public infrastructure to cater to the grown city.
Right.
But security is private, roads many part, the subway or the metro was private. Many aspects of Gurgaon, it's a private city. Noida, on the other hand, is a planned city. And of course, under past administration, law and order, whatever the reason be, the plan was there, but people weren't as bullish. And of course, you didn't have a airport. So Gurgaon had its own advantages in that sense. But what you're going to see, as you have already seen in terms of the growth of Noida in the last 5 years, is that with the coming up of the Noida International Airport, this whole urban conglomeration, this whole concentration is just going to continue expanding. And the reason it has become so is because an industrial development authority instead of an urban local body kind of a setup was the solution to this problem. Right? So you saw the government is able to make the investments, the nature that it wants to, connectivity ho, solid waste management ho, the way zoning, everything else that is, goes into urban planning, the state is trying to do through these bodies. So I think many other states are going to do.
So a lot of cities have legacy problems, right? Yeah. You can't really do much with a Mumbai, and it's like Delhi again has its own. So are we saying that probably the states who are ambitious enough and they create these new cities and then they come up, that could possibly be a way to solve this whole urban mess, and people start to migrate out. Right. You get tired of the chaos of Gurgaon or Delhi, you move to Noida. So that could
I think that will also happen because the nature of, the next 10, 20 years, the amount of push you're going to see on urbanization as a whole, infrastructure development, governance, financing, huge infrastructure projects in urban areas, that will mean all these different kinds of, so for an Amravati, which is a green field, you will also have, hopefully Bangalore improve its infrastructure. Delhi has one of the best infrastructure.
So competition and demand. So I'm going to then come to a related thing, which again is a bugbear for the middle class. And I personally think that we would grow, prices would be 10% cheaper and GDP would be at least 2 percentage points higher. I don't have any numbers to back this up, but it's an impression that I have. If we could take out most of the corruption. So there'll always be some corruption, but it's endemic. It is deep-seated. From every certificate you need, they have fixed digitization. You cannot, that OTP will never come. Somebody sitting there with a cookie, you have to go give 500 rupees, they remove that cookie and then your OTP will come. Okay, this is true. They have fixed the GST. Okay, because you see, it's not as if the private sector is not corrupt. So the private sector guys, chartered accountant, lawyers stopped making money. So now they've done a little handshake with the GST officer and the demands are now back on the table. So we are deeply, deeply, deeply corrupt. For a middle class person who's paying taxes, okay, so very, very small number of people pay taxes. How do we even imagine to be a developed country when we are so deeply corrupt?
See, corruption, Monika, I hate to break this to you, there is corruption, and corruption generally tends to escalate in markets where you have high growth. That's number one.
But without high growth, we've had corruption. Like growth or no growth, we are corrupt.
Well, so first of all, of course, I can feel your anguish as an Indian, and almost all these.
Because you feel that you're in the wrong game. You're the donkey of the system.
Because you pay taxes and
you follow the rules. you don't do anything which you think is wrong, and then you see the whole thing is thriving, and you're really the donkey of the system.
Yeah, well, it's unfortunate one feels like that, but the data tells you that the nature of corruption is different in different markets, Monica, but there is corruption, right? If you look at all emerging economies, whether you look at China or even developed markets, the nature, of the corruption is different. We wrote a paper on this 20 years back. And I'll tell you, this was again a World Bank study, which later it comes up with the Kaufman Index, perception of corruption. It's called the culture of corruption. And using that, there was a very influential Journal of Political Economy paper that used the New York parking tickets and violations.
Yeah, I saw that paper.
To show that diplomats in New York City who violate small. And they said that, look, it's the countries that have high culture of corruption do more violations, and hence it's a culture of corruption, which explains, which means that corruption is in our blood, it's in our DNA, you can't do very much with it. Now it's deeply offensive to people like me who understand a little bit of statistics, and we know that indices are like sausages. You put all kinds of things inside, and if you go looking, there are several other indices which are 80% correlated with what this perception is. Let me tell you another. That's why we wrote this paper. That there's another Kaufman index called Government Effectiveness Index. वो culture of corruption नहीं है, government effectiveness है. और उसका 80% correlation है with the culture. But what does Government Effectiveness Index measure? It measures the quality and quantity of public service. How are government jobs given? Meaning, what is the selection process?
We know the process is corrupt.
We know the process. Well, everyone can say that. But the point is, when you see the data systematically, you see which places are more, where is it less.
Geographical differences, but
yes.
in the teacher
and the magnitude, yes, exactly, right? Yes. And the amount of public infrastructure that you have, the subways you have. And there you must ask a question that it's the same Delhi walas. We will chase and behave very badly when it comes to buses. We'll jostle, and as a DU student,
all of us lose our elbows.
But think of the subway system, the metro. Everyone is orderly.
Yeah,
it's the same population. So it tells you something about certitude, meaning certainty of public infrastructure, both in terms of aayega, 3 minutes mein the next train is coming.
Correct.
Right? So everybody is better behaved. There's no jostling, and because there's less uncertainty, there's more availability of clean whatever infrastructure. It's the same answer when people say, what happens to Indians when they go to Singapore? They are so well, partly because, with greater wealth, as you grow more, you have more money, you have better infrastructure, more predictable infrastructure. Your behavior, the rules, you begin to adhere, and many other things change from a day-to-day basis. We found that government effectiveness explains a lot more in terms of the same UN diplomat behavior than the culture. And I'm inclined to then, one is a economist's response to that, कि देखो government effectiveness में at least levers तो हम जानते हैं कि भाई infrastructure बढ़ा दो, exams make them more transparent and more merit oriented, or at least have a rule which makes sense. While culture is in your DNA, what are you going to do about culture? How do you change that without, generational change, etc.? So as an economist, I find the government effectiveness story a bit appealing, but also as a statistician, I know these are all sausages.
No, except that if the government, especially the lower government, is itself deeply corrupt, then what do you do?
Well, I'll tell you, that is where there are now studies that have shown that, moving towards e-seva, moving like the passport service, that has now become like a fable, the way, fable success story of
one example.
No, Monica, it is one documented, studied example. I'll tell you, we will have to document the existing kinds of corruption and think of way out. We will also have to study jahan pe improvements hue hain, and why is it that we are able to short circuit and get people to behave better. Right? So, we have to think of means and mechanisms through which we can tackle this. Okay. Now, but again, there are different kinds of corruption. Huh?
Right. So, sorry, from corruption, the other thing which sort of riles a middle class person is this freebies.
Yeah.
Free bus tickets, free money, ladki behan, senior person.
Yeah.
They feel that we are paying for all of this. What am I getting in return? So what is the economic cost of freebies? And I know it's a political imperative, but it's a disaster for the fisc.
I think we will have to revisit the FRBM. That conversation has to happen again.
Okay, just explain in one line that
fiscal responsibility.
Correct.
Because I'll tell you what a common person today abhors is this electoral competition to announce, more populist measure. I think that is the nature
for the
of it.
beneficiaries. They are very happy about
Well,
it.
so we'll see how much they can eventually, where this is going, because I'll tell you, we have enough examples, right? Think of Punjab. Punjab had thriving industry 20 years back.
No longer.
No longer. Why?
Right.
Because cross-subsidization, which is what you're talking about, that when you are going to overcharge or penalize or just charge so much to one sector to cross-subsidize another sector, you should not imagine, and that's why economics is such a beautiful science when you begin to study, that yaar, accounting nahi hai ki aap till cows come home you will keep taxing and charging more for power and giving it to farmers. वो नहीं हो सकता है. What happened in Punjab? All industry vanished. Where did they go? Himachal चले गए, इधर उधर सब जगह चले गए. Where they are more investor friendly, where they are more industry friendly, right? Now what has happened to farmers of Punjab? And what has happened to the ecology, the water table? There is desertification. There are all kinds of other problems, right?
Of course.
So think of it that this freebie, what is non-viable, non-sustainable, and I'll tell you 86% of Indian farmers supported the farm laws. The fact that they weren't vocal, the fact that they did not descend on Delhi, meant that, the silent majority was sort of overlooked. But that is the nature of democracy, Monika. Why are we surprised?
No.
Look at farmer suicide is such a big issue.
It's not surprise, it's just deep sadness.
It's a dismay, yes.
It's a dismay that my potential is so much and I'm so shackled.
Yeah. Well, except that we are, like I said, we have figured way out to which many states have already brought in those changes, such that even within agriculture, it's not, it's fisheries which is your fastest growing, milk which is your fastest growing, fruits which are fast growing. So I'll tell you, markets and even local policies are shifting towards what people eventually want. The politics of it will remain the way it is, right? It might, and that's how people vote, etc. But there is one other thing I think it's important for people to recognize, that in many states where the state capacity at the local level is not very high, and I still am struggling with, let's say, neonatal deaths or maternal mortality, which is a problem, then cash is very appealing to a policy maker.
Correct.
Because उसमें सबसे कम leakage भी है, direct benefit transfer है. I know that when 1,000 rupee will go to this 25-year-old young woman, she will at least consume part of it. लेकिन वो something will go to her. Unlike, let's say there's a leakage on the way, take home ration सड़ा हुआ है, whatever. So this is a chicken and egg. This is a, it's a time issue. Right. So state capacities are being built as we speak because people demand better service. Okay. And health and education is where you are going to see that there is an instant appeal to giving cash. That's why some of this remain. But अब richer states में, जहाँ पे these problems are not there now this exercise has to happen, that what is this cash for? What is the objective you are trying to achieve? Where is the market failure that we are trying to do? Right? And that is where I think conversation on Delhi, कि utilities free कर देना. Well, is it price discrimination of some kind where इतना usage के बाद it will escalate as it is? Or are we to say, that bandwidth you keep expanding, so very large number of people are going to get free stuff. Right. Then the problem is, how are you going to do electricity, the distribution reforms that you have to.
Right. That's right.
Or water, tankers, mafia, all these concerns.
We see them. One last question on expanding the tax net.
Yeah.
Again, the worry is that not all the people who should be paying taxes, you leave the exempt income out. Okay, that's a political problem. But I don't think people who should be paying tax are paying tax, and this is a problem that finance ministers for I think the last 30 years have tried to do. But why are we not using big data to track spending better? Because finally it'll come out in what you're buying, right?
Yeah. No, it's a well-known suggestion, Monika. It is something that we have also suggested. The point is, there is a lot of administrative data with finance ministry, and let's start with GST itself. It is wealth of information that it is sitting on. sometimes the way to expand or increase collection is by just simplifying the rules themselves.
Right.
Alternately, I can have Inspector Raj and chase you with these tax inspectors, and there also it will rise. But the pain point and the long-term cost on growth is very high, right? So I think there is sort of an acceptance of that reality. The point is, to what extent is this data going into? I'm being told it is, which is why we are waiting for the tax reform announcements to happen,
Okay.
which is imminent.
Okay.
So let's just
Okay.
wait and
Okay. Last one comment on GDP in the next 5 years, because this GDP growth number, I think, really important for all of us as people who are employees, people who are entrepreneurs, people who are consumers, as well as investors. So where are we at? And because we're in the middle of physical wars, tariff wars, it's a world which is really in a difficult place. How do you look at us over the next 5 years?
I'll tell you, one is a wishful statement I'm going to make. Under no condition should we be normalizing 6.5.
Right.
This is a young country.
Absolutely.
We have just come out of poverty. We have a long way to go. So we have to keep targeting 8. 7.5, 8 is what our target, in the medium term has to be. And for the next few decades, frankly. The other is the reality of the world today. But even in the midst of that reality, we know that our domestic demand is a strategic component.
60% of the GDP.
Exactly. Right. And repeatedly in the last 20-25 years, we have seen that many aspects of our market and our growth have been fed, financed, fueled domestically. Right? And this is where our story is fundamentally different from China. China has a repressed domestic demand, which is why these global turmoils hurt them much more and are likely to hurt them. That's why you're seeing a decline, and it's a long-term strategic sort of a trend you are seeing downwards. Ours is an upward trend. For it to maximize that will mean that we now work on getting urban infra. Those are the big spend, the deregulation commission, all of these bottlenecks and the regulatory cholesterol that we have been talking for now 20 years. It's time to fructify these things. And that is where the marginal gains are going to happen. You have a young population which is healthier today, better fed, getting more skilling, right? Of course, it's still an experimentation because the gap there remains still pretty high, right? Industries repeatedly saying that we need more skilled people. So we have all the right ingredients. The recipe is all well known. We'll just have to declog, get the regulations.
That's right.
And contract enforcement.
So we leave on a positive note.
Yes.
I think I can go on for another 2 hours, but
so could I.
We should stop. And I actually look forward to having you back here soon. Thank you so much.
I'd love to be back. Thank you. Thank you.
Two women talking economic policy, biggest flex. I enjoyed the conversation very much. Hope you did too, because I could have gone on for another 2 hours. Please tell me who else you'd like to listen to. What are the topics you'd like me to cover? Leave your comments in the section below. This is the Growing India podcast, and I'll be back soon with another very interesting guest.